The galaxy had never known true silence until she arrived. Ships, planets, even entire star systems fell quiet whenever her name was whispered. The Queen of Erinder, as she was called in hushed tones, wore a mask that concealed her true face, and none dared question her. It wasn't just the mystery of her appearance that inspired fear. It was the stories, tales of those who had tried to understand her and vanished without a trace. Empires trembled at her command, and treaties were signed without a word spoken. For many, she wasn't a person but a living legend, part myth, part nightmare. Her reign of dominance stretched far beyond her star system. Though none had seen her true visage, the stories painted her as ruthless and cruel, her every gesture calculated, every move laced with hidden motives. Her mask, an intricate piece of alien craftsmanship that shimmered with silvery hues and embedded gems, hid her expressions and perhaps the secrets of her kind. Some believed she was the last of her species, a cursed monarch wandering the stars. Others thought her a harbinger of destruction. But no one, not even the boldest bounty hunters, dared to approach her with curiosity. Fear was far too effective a barrier. Then there was Earth, small, inconsequential in the grand scheme of the galaxy. It had avoided much of the interstellar conflicts that plagued other worlds simply by being too insignificant to notice. That changed the day the masked queen arrived at the edge of the Sol system. Her ship, a massive structure of black metal and glowing red veins, blotted out the stars as it loomed over Earth's orbit. Satellites malfunctioned, space stations scrambled for answers, and humanity collectively held its breath. The first broadcast came from her ship. It was a strange, wordless hum that resonated in the bones of anyone who heard it. The noise wasn't language in any traditional sense, but its meaning was clear. The Queen was calling. To what end, no one knew. Panic spread like wildfire. Governments convened in emergency sessions, debating whether to respond or hide. Militaries braced for a fight they knew they couldn't win. The Queen waited. Weeks passed. No attacks came. The Queen's ship remained motionless in orbit, an unspoken challenge hanging heavy over the planet. It was as if she were waiting for someone, anyone, to answer her call. In the middle of this chaos lived Elias Harper, an astrophysicist by trade and an oddity among humans. Elias was the sort of person who looked at the stars not with fear, but with wonder. He'd grown up dreaming of alien worlds, sketching crude maps of imagined galaxies in his notebooks. While the rest of humanity feared the unknown, Elias embraced it. So when the Queen's ship arrived, he was one of the few who wasn't paralyzed by terror. Instead, he was curious. "Do you ever wonder what she's thinking?" Elias asked his colleague one day, staring up at the Queen's ship through a telescope. "She's probably thinking about how quickly she can wipe us out," his colleague replied grimly. Elias shook his head. "Maybe. But what if she's waiting for something else? What if she's lonely?" His colleague snorted. "Lonely? That's what you think an alien queen with a death mask is feeling? Get real, Harper." But the idea stuck with Elias. There was something about the Queen's silence that felt less like a threat and more like an invitation. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it deep in his gut, the way an astronomer feels when they look at the endless expanse of space and just know there's something out there waiting to be discovered. It was that feeling that led Elias to make the most reckless decision of his life. While governments debated and military leaders strategized, Elias crafted a message, a simple one, written in every universal mathematical code he could think of. It was a greeting, an introduction, and a question all rolled into one. "Why are you here?" To his surprise, he received an answer. It came in the form of a single pulse of light from the Queen's ship, a pattern that danced across his computer screen like a heartbeat. It wasn't language, not exactly, but it felt alive. And it felt like an invitation. Elias didn't tell anyone what he planned to do next. He knew they would try to stop him, and he didn't want to waste time arguing. He commandeered a small, outdated shuttle from the observatory's research facility, input the coordinates he'd deciphered from the Queen's response, and launched himself into orbit. As the shuttle approached the Queen's ship, Elias's courage wavered. The vessel was even more imposing up close, its surface an impossible tangle of sharp angles and smooth curves that seemed to shift as he looked at it. It dwarfed his shuttle, making him feel like a speck of dust drifting toward a mountain. But the ship didn't attack. Instead, a narrow beam of light scanned his shuttle, and a docking bay opened, its interior glowing with a soft, inviting light. Elias hesitated for only a moment before piloting his shuttle inside. The air inside the ship was warm, almost humid, and carried a faint, metallic scent. The docking bay was vast and empty, save for a single pathway that seemed to pulse with light as Elias stepped onto it. He followed the path, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but he couldn't turn back now. The path led him to a massive chamber filled with faintly glowing orbs that floated in midair. They pulsed softly, almost like they were breathing. At the center of the chamber stood the queen. She was taller than any human, her figure draped in flowing robes that shimmered like liquid silver. Her mask was as intimidating as the stories had described, its surface a flawless blend of sharp edges and smooth curves, with glowing patterns that seemed to shift and dance like fire. But what struck Elias most was her presence. She radiated an aura of power and loneliness, a quiet sadness that seemed to fill the chamber like a tangible force. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Elias's mind raced with 1,000 questions, but before he could speak, the queen raised a hand. The orbs in the chamber began to move, shifting and spinning in intricate patterns. Images appeared within them, memories, perhaps, or messages. Elias saw flashes of alien worlds, vast and beautiful, teeming with life. He saw battles, destruction, and the queen standing alone amidst the ruins. He saw her mask being placed on her face by figures who seemed both reverent and fearful. The queen gestured again, and the orbs vanished, leaving only the two of them in the chamber. She took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice was a low, melodic hum that resonated in Elias's chest. He didn't understand her words, but he felt their meaning. "Why have you come?" Elias swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he replied, "To understand." The queen tilted her head, as if considering his answer. Then, to his astonishment, she reached up and removed her mask. What Elias saw beneath the mask was not what he expected. It wasn't monstrous or grotesque, but it wasn't entirely human, either. Her features were delicate and alien, her skin a shimmering shade that seemed to shift with the light. Her eyes, large and luminous, held a depth of emotion that took Elias's breath away. In that moment, he realized the stories about her were wrong. She wasn't a monster or a conqueror. She was something far more complicated. She was alone. And for the first time, Elias felt hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could bridge the gap between their worlds. Elias stood frozen, captivated by her unmasked face. Her eyes, larger than any human's, shimmered like twin nebulae, filled with swirling colors that seemed to draw him in. They carried an undeniable weight, a deep, haunting sorrow interwoven with curiosity. He found himself unable to look away, even as every fiber of his being screamed at him to retreat. The queen tilted her head slightly, her movements impossibly fluid, almost like water flowing through space. It was a gesture of inquiry, not aggression. Elias's breath caught in his throat. This was no mindless conqueror. This was an intelligent being, an alien monarch who had somehow endured pain on a scale he could barely fathom. I didn't come to harm you," Elias stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I came to understand." The queen remained silent for a moment, her gaze piercing. Then, with a grace that defied logic, she extended her hand. It hovered in the air between them, long, delicate fingers outstretched as if inviting him into her world. Elias hesitated. His instincts told him that whatever happened next would change everything. Not just for him, but for all of humanity. Swallowing his fear, he raised his own hand and placed it lightly on hers. Her skin was cool and smooth, like polished stone, but the moment their hands touched, a flood of sensations overwhelmed him. Images, emotions, and memories surged through his mind at an almost unbearable speed. He saw the Queen's world before it had been reduced to ruin, a breathtaking realm of towering crystalline cities and vibrant forests that shimmered with bioluminescent light. He felt the pride of her people, their unity, their deep connection to one another. And then came the war. The invasion had been swift and merciless. An unknown force had descended upon her world, consuming everything in its path. The Queen had fought valiantly, leading her people in a desperate bid for survival. But the enemy was relentless, and one by one, her people fell. The final image was of her donning the mask, a symbol of leadership, yes, but also of sacrifice. The mask had not only concealed her face but had bound her to a vow of eternal solitude, a punishment she had accepted to protect the remnants of her people's legacy. Elias staggered back, gasping for air as the connection broke. His head swam, and tears streamed down his face, not from pain, but from the sheer weight of what he had seen. You've lost everything," he said, his voice shaking. The Queen's eyes softened, and for the first time, Elias thought he saw a flicker of something he hadn't expected: gratitude. The Queen led him through her ship, the walls pulsing faintly with a life of their own. As they walked, Elias couldn't help but notice how empty it felt. The vast halls were silent, devoid of any other life forms. It was as if the ship itself mourned alongside its ruler. They arrived at a smaller chamber, circular and bathed in soft, golden light. At its center floated a large, translucent orb filled with swirling colors that seemed to mirror the Queen's eyes. She gestured to it, and Elias instinctively understood that this was something important, perhaps the heart of her ship, or even a repository of knowledge. As he approached, the orb pulsed, and another wave of imagery flooded his mind. This time, the visions were focused on Earth. He saw humanity through the Queen's eyes, fragile, divided, and chaotic, yet brimming with potential. She had been watching them, studying their flaws and their strengths, trying to decide if they were worth trusting. Elias turned to her, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. "You've been waiting for someone to come to you, haven't you? To prove that we're more than what you've seen from a distance." The Queen inclined her head, a subtle nod that sent a shiver down his spine. Her silent confirmation carried a weight that no words could. "But why me?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "Why did you let me come here?" For the first time, the Queen spoke words he could understand, not through sound, but through a direct connection to his mind. Her voice was like a melody carried on the wind, haunting and beautiful. "You were unafraid to listen." The simplicity of her answer struck Elias like a thunderbolt. In a galaxy dominated by fear, mistrust, and violence, he had done the one thing no one else had dared. He had approached her with an open heart. Over the days that followed, Elias learned more about the Queen and her people than he ever thought possible. She showed him fragments of their culture, songs that resonated through the ship's walls, holographic dances performed by figures of light, and even a form of art that involved weaving strands of energy into intricate patterns. It was unlike anything Elias had ever seen, and he couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of it all. In turn, he shared stories of Earth. He described its diverse landscapes, its history of triumphs and failures, and its people's relentless curiosity. The Queen listened intently, her eyes glowing softly as she absorbed every word. Though she didn't say much, Elias could sense her interest growing. For the first time in centuries, perhaps millennia, she was no longer alone. But not everyone on Earth viewed Elias's actions with such optimism. From the moment his shuttle had disappeared into the Queen's ship, chaos had erupted back home. Governments scrambled to determine whether he was a traitor, a hero, or simply a fool. Military leaders debated launching an attack, fearing that Elias's actions might provoke the Queen into destroying Earth. Protests broke out in major cities, some demanding peace and others calling for immediate war. When the Queen's ship finally moved, descending closer to Earth's surface, the panic reached a fever pitch. Cities went into lockdown, and armies prepared for what they believed would be humanity's final stand. Inside the ship, Elias stood beside the Queen as she guided the vessel with a mere gesture of her hand. "They're terrified," he said softly, watching the chaos unfold on the monitors. "They are as you were," the Queen replied, her voice resonating in his mind. "But fear can be overcome." Elias turned to her, his expression resolute. "Let me speak to them. Let me show them that you're not here to destroy us." The Queen regarded him for a long moment before nodding. She extended her hand once more, and as Elias took it, he felt a surge of warmth and strength. Together, they stepped onto a platform that began to lower, bringing them face to face with humanity's fear. The world watched in stunned silence as the Queen and the human who had dared to approach her descended from the ship. The air crackled with tension, and for a moment, it felt as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Elias raised his hand, a gesture of peace, and began to speak. Elias stepped forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the weight of countless eyes on him, the collective gaze of humanity watching as he stood side by side with the alien queen. Her presence beside him was magnetic yet intimidating, her unmasked face a stark contrast to the terrifying stories that had surrounded her for centuries. Still, she radiated no malice, only quiet power and, somehow, trust in him. The cameras floating in the air transmitted their every move to billions of screens worldwide. A field of soldiers stood frozen before them, their weapons raised but trembling. Even the bravest among them hesitated, knowing that one wrong move could mean the end of humanity. Elias took a deep breath, forcing himself to speak through the tension in his throat. "People of Earth," he began, his voice trembling but steadying as he continued. "I know what you're feeling. I know the fear that's consuming you because I felt it, too. I was afraid of what I didn't understand, of what she might want from us. But I came here not to fight, not to confront, but to listen, and I've learned more than I ever imagined." He paused, glancing at the queen. Her glowing eyes met his, and he felt her silent encouragement. Turning back to the crowd, he pressed on. "She isn't our enemy. She doesn't want to destroy us. She came here because she was waiting for someone to meet her without fear. And what I've seen, what she shared with me, is incredible." The murmurs of the crowd began to rise, doubt rippling through the gathered masses and the countless viewers watching the broadcast. A gruff voice from the ranks of soldiers called out, "How do we know you're not being controlled? How do we know this isn't a trick?" Elias felt the pressure of the question, but before he could answer, the queen stepped forward. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and every eye locked onto her as she raised her hand. A ripple of panic moved through the crowd, but Elias quickly raised his own hand in a calming gesture. "Wait," he urged. "Just watch." The queen reached out with her hand toward the nearest soldier. For a moment, the man flinched, his fingers tightening on the trigger of his weapon. But she didn't attack. Instead, she extended her palm toward him, and from her hand, a faint orb of light emerged. It hovered in the air, slowly drifting toward him. The soldier hesitated but didn't fire. The orb stopped before him and began to shift, shimmering with soft images that flickered like reflections on water. The crowd gasped as the images grew clearer. They were visions of the queen's world, her people's beauty, and the tragedy that had consumed them. The soldier's hardened face softened as the images flowed, showing her desperate efforts to protect her people and the burden of solitude she had carried for centuries. When the orb faded, the soldier lowered his weapon, his hands trembling. He turned back to his comrades, his voice quiet but firm. "She's not here to hurt us." Elias stepped forward again, addressing the crowd and the world beyond. "We have a chance, a rare chance, to make contact with someone who isn't human, to learn from her and share what makes us human. She could have destroyed us the moment she arrived, but she didn't. She chose to wait. She chose to hope. That says more about her than any of the stories we've been told." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, but now they were mixed with curiosity rather than fear. Slowly, some of the soldiers began lowering their weapons, their postures relaxing. The queen stood silently beside Elias, her presence commanding yet unthreatening. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice shouted, "If she's peaceful, what does she want from us?" Elias turned toward the queen, the unspoken question lingering between them. She inclined her head slightly and raised her hand, palm upward. A small, shimmering orb appeared, similar to the one she had shown the soldier. It floated upward, expanding until it filled the air above the crowd with a radiant display of light. The orb displayed a vision of unity, humans and aliens working together, exchanging knowledge and building something greater than either could achieve alone. It wasn't just an image, it was a promise, a possibility. And with it came a single, resonant thought that echoed in the minds of everyone watching, transmitted not through words but through emotion. Connection. Elias looked back at the crowd, his voice strong now. "She doesn't want war or power. She wants to build something with us. A future where we're not defined by fear or destruction but by what we can achieve together. This is our chance to be more than we've ever been." The days that followed were a whirlwind. While the initial skepticism lingered, the queen's willingness to share glimpses of her knowledge began to soften the world's collective fear. She revealed technologies that could heal sicknesses and create clean energy, solutions to problems humanity had grappled with for centuries. But she did so slowly, carefully, as if testing their readiness. Elias became the unofficial ambassador between her and Earth. He traveled with her, translating her thoughts and gestures into words that humanity could understand. It wasn't always easy. Many still distrusted her, and there were governments and factions that saw her as a threat no matter what she offered. Elias often found himself caught in the middle, defending her to those who refused to see her as anything other than an enemy. But through it all, the Queen remained patient. Her presence alone began to change the way people thought about the universe and their place in it. She wasn't just an alien, she was a mirror, reflecting humanity's potential and its flaws. One night, as they stood on the observation deck of her ship, staring out at the glittering expanse of stars, Elias turned to her. "Why me?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. "Out of all the people on Earth, why did you choose to trust me?" The Queen regarded him with those luminous eyes, her gaze piercing yet kind. When she answered, her voice resonated in his mind like a melody carried on the wind. "Because you chose to see me, not the mask." Elias's throat tightened. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. In that moment, he realized that the connection between them was more than just a bridge between two species. It was a bond built on something far deeper, understanding. And as they stood there, side by side, Elias couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of a story far greater than either of them. The Queen's words lingered in Elias's mind long after she spoke them. "Because you chose to see me, not the mask." It was a simple statement, yet it carried layers of meaning. The mask, he realized, wasn't just a literal object, it was the barrier between her and the rest of the universe. A shield to protect her vulnerabilities, yes, but also a symbol of how others had judged her without truly understanding her. Elias had stripped that away, not with force but with an open heart. But their journey was far from over. On Earth, not everyone saw the Queen's arrival as an opportunity for peace. Despite her displays of goodwill and the technology she had offered, factions within governments and among private groups continued to resist. The fear that had been ingrained for so long didn't vanish overnight. Whispers of conspiracy spread like wildfire, claims that the Queen was deceiving them, that her gifts were a Trojan horse meant to subjugate humanity. Some even accused Elias of being a puppet, brainwashed into serving her agenda. The most dangerous opposition came from a coalition of militarized nations calling themselves the Earth Sovereignty Defense Force, ESDF. They believed that humanity's independence was at stake and that the Queen's presence, no matter how peaceful, was an existential threat. The tipping point came when the ESDF launched a surprise attack on the Queen's ship. Elias was on board when it happened. He had just finished discussing a new energy-sharing initiative with her when the alarms began to wail, the walls of the ship glowing red with warning signals. He rushed to the observation deck, his heart sinking as he saw Earth-based fighter ships swarming toward them, their weapons glowing with charged energy. "No," Elias muttered, disbelief and anger coursing through him. He turned to the Queen, who stood calmly, her gaze fixed on the approaching ships. "You can't fight back. If you do, it'll confirm everything they're afraid of." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing in thought. When she spoke, her words resonated in his mind. "I will not harm them, but I will not allow them to harm us." Elias's stomach churned. There has to be another way. The Queen raised her hand, and the ship responded instantly. Its surface shimmered, transforming into a reflective shield that absorbed the incoming blasts from the Earth ships. The energy from their weapons dissipated harmlessly, but the Queen didn't fire back. Instead, she projected a beam of light into space, a radiant display that spiraled outward like a message written across the stars. Elias recognized the pattern. It was the same greeting he had sent her when he first made contact. She was responding not with aggression, but with communication. A plea for understanding. But the Earth ships didn't stop. The attacks grew more intense, their weapons pounding against the Queen's shields. Each blast reverberated through the ship, and Elias felt the vibrations in his bones. He turned to her, desperation in his voice. "If they keep this up, someone's going to make a mistake. They'll escalate, and then—" The Queen raised her hand again, this time gesturing toward the Earth ships. A wave of energy rippled outward, freezing the attackers in place. Their engines stopped, their weapons dimmed, and their ships floated motionless in space. It wasn't an act of destruction, but of restraint, a show of power that was simultaneously merciful and unyielding. The broadcast channels on Earth erupted with confusion and outrage. News anchors speculated wildly, some praising the Queen for her restraint, others condemning her as a tyrant. Protesters took to the streets, their signs split between calls for peace and demands for resistance. The world was fracturing, and Elias knew that if they didn't act quickly, everything they had worked for could collapse. In the days that followed, Elias worked tirelessly to mediate between the Queen and Earth's leaders. The ESDF, humiliated by their failed attack, refused to engage in talks. Other nations were hesitant, fearing retribution from the Queen despite her lack of aggression. Tensions ran high, and Elias felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. One night, as he sat in the Queen's ship, poring over diplomatic briefs and monitoring Earth's broadcasts, she approached him. Her presence was as commanding as ever, but there was a softness in her demeanor that caught him off guard. "You carry a heavy burden," she said, her voice gentle in his mind. Elias looked up at her, exhaustion etched into his face. "It's nothing compared to what you've been through." "Pain cannot be measured," she replied, "but it can be shared." Elias hesitated, then nodded. I don't know if I'm enough. They don't trust me. They barely trust themselves. How can I convince them to trust you?" The Queen reached out, her hand hovering just above his shoulder. Though she didn't touch him, Elias felt a wave of warmth radiate from her, a comforting presence that steadied his nerves. Trust is not built in a day. It is a seed that grows slowly, nurtured by patience and understanding. You have planted that seed. Let it grow. Her words struck a chord deep within him. Elias took a deep breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Then we'll keep trying," he said. "No matter how long it takes." The Queen inclined her head, a faint glow in her eyes that Elias had come to recognize as her version of a smile. Together, their efforts began to bear fruit. Slowly but surely, voices of reason emerged from the chaos. Scientists, scholars, and even some government leaders began to advocate for peace, citing the Queen's restraint and the benefits of her technology. The Queen herself remained steadfast, offering gifts to humanity without demanding anything in return. Her actions spoke louder than any words could, gradually chipping away at the fear and mistrust that had gripped the planet. Elias became a symbol of this fragile alliance, his story spreading across the globe. People began to see him not as a traitor, but as a bridge, a human who had dared to step into the unknown and come back with hope. But not everyone was ready to embrace that hope. The Queen's greatest challenge came not from Earth's governments, but from within her own ship. Unbeknownst to Elias, remnants of her people still existed, scattered survivors who had hidden themselves across the galaxy. And they did not all agree with her methods. A faction of them, bitter and vengeful, had infiltrated her ship, intending to seize control and use its power to exact revenge on the universe that had wronged them. Elias discovered their presence one night when alarms echoed through the halls, and the ship's lights flickered ominously. The Queen led him to the central chamber, where a group of alien figures stood, their forms similar to hers but their eyes hardened with anger. They had removed their masks, revealing faces etched with scars and hatred. "This is your plan," one of them snarled at the Queen, speaking in a guttural voice that Elias could understand through their shared connection. "To grovel before these primitives? To offer them gifts while we suffer?" The Queen stood tall, her presence unwavering. "It is not groveling to seek peace. Revenge will not heal our wounds. Peace is weakness," the alien spat. "If you will not act, we will." They lunged toward her, and chaos erupted. The Queen stood firm, her presence radiating calm as the rogue faction charged. With a single resonant gesture, she unleashed a wave of energy, not to harm, but to immobilize them. "Pain cannot justify destruction," she said, her voice resonating with power and sorrow. Elias stepped forward, addressing the faction. "She offers hope, not vengeance. If you reject that, you're no better than the ones who destroyed your home." The words struck deep, and the rebels hesitated, their anger faltering. The Queen extended her hand to them, offering not punishment but forgiveness. On Earth, tensions slowly eased as humanity witnessed her resolve and restraint. The ESDF, shamed by their aggression, disbanded, and peace talks flourished. Together, Elias and the Queen worked tirelessly, bridging two worlds that had once seemed destined for conflict. Trust grew, fragile but real, like a seed finally sprouting. As the Queen's ship hovered over Earth, its lights glowing softly in the night sky, Elias turned to her. "We did it," he said. She gazed at him, her eyes reflecting both relief and gratitude. "No," she replied. "We've only just begun."